Alright guys, today we are going to cover the basics of how to make changes to the mechanical ventilator based on arterial blood gas results. So first thing we're going to do, we're going to cover here is just the results that you get when you send off an ABG. Okay, so when you send off an ABG, you're going to get a handful of results here. The first one you're going to get is a pH value, and this is going to be normal value 7.35 to 7.45. You're also going to get a partial pressure of carbon dioxide, which is going to be 35 to 45 milliliters mercury. You will also get a bicarb result. Bicarb is going to be 22 to 26 milliequivalents per liter. And you are going to get a partial pressure of oxygen, which is going to be 80 to 100 millimeters of mercury. And lastly, you are going to get a oxygen saturation, which is going to be 95 to 100%. You can think of SaO2 as SpO2, just the difference is SpO2 measures it peripherally and SaO2 is measuring it from arterial blood. Okay, so those are the ABG results you're going to get. Another thing quick we need to cover is some concepts to know. It's going to help you when we're evaluating these ABG results here towards the end. Okay, the first one is if you're in nursing school or you've already graduated, you've probably heard of or seen this mnemonic of ROME, which stands for respiratory, opposite, and metabolic equal. Okay, so when in this mnemonic, when it's talking about respiratory, this is referring to the partial pressure of CO2 result. So it's referring to this value here. When it says opposite, this is referring to the pH value. Metabolic is going to be referring to the bicarb value, and equal is going to be referring to the pH. For this video, since it's based on vent changes and we're focused on respiratory, actually going to just kind of squiggle this out. So today's video, we're just focused on the respiratory opposite. So all this saying is this: respiratory is the PaCO2. If this value is high, then the pH will be low, and then vice versa. So if this value is low, then the pH will be elevated. Okay, and then real quick, a couple more things to know. A big concept that's going to help you towards the end here when we're evaluating these ABGs is you need to know that CO2 acts as an acid. And I'll cover this in more detail here later, but just keep this in the back of your mind. This will be very helpful to know moving forward. Lastly, a few more things here. First one you need to know is going to be tidal volume. Tidal volume. So tidal volume is the volume of air that's moved in and out of the lungs during a normal breath. So this is the volume of air moved in and out of the lungs during a normal breath. And a normal range for tidal volume is going to be 6 to 8 mLs per kilo. We'll do an example. We'll use this example throughout the video. So let's say, for example, if you have a patient that is 80 kilos, that's about 175 pounds, this tidal volume is going to be somewhere between 480 mLs and 640 mLs. Other ones we need to know is going to be the FiO2. So this is the fraction of inspired oxygen. This is the amount of oxygen that is in the air that the patient's breathing. So this, you'll see this on the vent. Oops, excuse me. That can be adjusted there. Remember, room air is 21%. Fraction of inspired oxygen. Other one we need to know is pretty simple here. Just the respiratory rate. That's just measured in breaths per minute. And then lastly, we need to be familiar with PEEP. PEEP is positive and expiratory pressure. So what PEEP is the pressure that remains in the lungs at the end of expiration or following expiration. Pressure that remains in the lungs following expiration. And what PEEP does is it's going to prevent alkalosis by keeping the alveoli open. So it keeps the alveoli open, and it expands surface area for gas exchange. So by expanding that surface area of gas exchange and keeping the alveoli open, PEEP works to improve oxygenation. Okay, so these 4 in blue here, these are all settings that we can change on the vent. Can be. So that's why it's important to know those, understand what they are before we get into it. Okay, so now let's go ahead and get into it. So we're going to break this down into 3. When you're adjusting the settings on the vent, you're going to be trying to correct most likely 3 major issues. So we'll start here. The 3 major issues that you'll be trying to correct by adjusting these vent settings. The first one is going to be your patient is not breathing enough. Number 2 is going to be the opposite. Patient, is breathing too much. And third will be that the patient does not have enough O2. Not enough O2. Let's get this in the middle here. Nah, that's okay. Okay, not enough O2. Okay, so coming back here to this first one. Okay, so if a patient is not breathing enough, what would that look like? So that's going to look like the patient has a decreased respiratory rate or a small decreased tidal volume, right? Remember, tidal volume is the amount of air moved in and out during a normal breath. So if they're not breathing, they have a slow respiratory rate, if they're not breathing out a lot of air, that is going to lead the patient's going to be retaining CO2. They're not going to be breathing it out, right? It's going to be accumulating there and building up in their lungs. So if the patient is retaining CO2, this is where this CO2 as an acid comes into play, and this is how the mnemonic works, right? So if they're retaining CO2, what's that going to look like? So that's going to look like an elevated PaCO2, right? We said it's normally 35 to 45 millimeters mercury, so this will be elevated above 45 milliliters of mercury, and from the mnemonic, and we know that CO2 acts as an acid with an elevated PaCO2, your pH has become more acidic, right? So the pH becoming more acidic means the pH is decreasing. So your pH will be less than 7.35. Okay, so you have a patient, they're not breathing enough or not moving enough air. So how do you fix this? Your goal, you're gonna want to make them breathe more, right? So the two ways that we can do this is going to be, you can either increase the respiratory rate, or I'll put and/or, you could increase the tidal volume. So both of these, so if you increase the respiratory rate, they'll be breathing more frequently, right? I mean, moving that air more frequently, moving more out. And if you increase the tidal volume, so they'll be taking bigger breaths, right? And then they'll be blowing off more CO2, so that will help to combat that retaining, so to get more CO2 out of the lungs. So those are the two ways that you can fix that issue there. Okay, we'll move on here to this, where their patient is breathing too much. So in this example, the patient might have an elevated respiratory rate or an increased tidal volume. So let's say we talked about if our patient was 80 kilos, right? We said this would be normal. So maybe if they're breathing too much, maybe their tidal volume is, let's say, 800 instead of 640, right? They're taking really big breaths. So we'll say that's with the 80 kilo patient. Okay, so the patient's either breathing too fast, too many breaths per minute, or taking really large breaths, so it expanded or elevated tidal volume. So the issue, if they're breathing too much, is they're blowing off lots of CO2, right? Lots of CO2, so the opposite of retaining. Okay, so if they're blowing off lots of CO2, what's that going to look like here? And we know they're going to have a decreased partial pressure of carbon dioxide. So we said it's normally 35 to 45. So this will be less than 35 millimeters mercury. And once again, we know CO2 acts as an acid, and by using our mnemonic, if there's low CO2, that means the pH is going to move more alkalotic, and alkalotic pH means it's elevated above 7.45, right? Okay, so then how do we fix this? So now we want the patient to retain more CO2, right? So there's two ways to fix that. We can either decrease their respiratory rate, or, and/or, I'll say again, we can make them take smaller breaths, and that is by decreasing their tidal volume. Both of those will help the patient to help retain more CO2, so that'll elevate this PaCO2 back into normal range and help decrease the pH. Okay, the third problem here we'll cover is the patient not having enough O2. So what that will look like would be a partial pressure of oxygen less than 80 millimeters mercury. Remember, we said this value is typically 80 to 100. And just a good side note here, a PaO2 of 60 is typically equivalent to, right, an SaO2 about 90%. And remember this, you can think of it as SpO2 if it's easier for you to think of it that way. So a PaO2 of 60 is equal to a SaO2 of 90%. So if we have a patient that has a PaO2 and a decreased SaO2, then we need to improve their oxygenation, right? So the two ways we can fix this is, first one, pretty simple. You can increase their FiO2. So maybe if they're on, 40% FiO2, then it could be increased to 50 or 60, depending on, how low their oxygen levels are. The other way to fix this is to increase their PEEP. And remember, we talked about up here how PEEP works. So PEEP works to keep the alveoli open. It's going to expand that surface area, and that is going to help improve the oxygenation. So that is the two ways you can help get the patient more O2. And I would say, obviously, go by your facility rules. You know, if you're a nurse and you are allowed to adjust the ventilator, I personally wouldn't just go cranking up the PEEP. There's definitely things you have to monitor for here, like volutrauma and barotrauma, that can cause injury to the patient. So definitely going to want to consult with whoever the provider is, or RT, whoever it is responsible for adjusting those vents. And we'll just put that, always go by your facility. If you're a nurse and you're not allowed to adjust the vent, then don't touch the vent, right? You can still know this stuff and know, maybe what you would do theoretically. It's good to know, but definitely always follow your facility's protocols. Okay, so those are the 3 major issues there that we can correct. I just want to do a quick recap here, and then we'll do some examples. Okay, so a quick recap. So if you're trying to correct the pH based off of the PaCO2, then there's 2 things you can do. You can either increase or decrease respiratory rate and or increase or decrease the tidal volume. Then if you're trying to correct oxygenation status based on PaO2, SaO2, then you can either increase or decrease the FiO2 and or increase or decrease the PEEP. Now, we didn't cover, it is possible that they are over-oxygenated, right? And then this would be, example 3 would be opposite, but for this video, we're going to stick with these main 3 here. So this is the big recap. This is the kind of the main lesson. If you can understand this, then you should be able to walk through some of these examples we'll do here. All right, let's knock out some examples real quick. Okay, first example, let's say you send off an ABG and you get a pH 7.29. You get a PaO2 of, we'll go 83. You get a PaCO2 of 63. You get a bicarb of 26. And you get oxygen saturation of 95. Okay, so we're just going through this example here. If you're looking at this, you can see that the PaO2 is within normal range, 80 to 100. This is within normal range, 22 to 26. And the SaO2, 95 to 100, is also within normal range. So you have 2 values here that are outside of your normal range, right? And once again, we know that with a elevated PaCO2, you're going to have a decreased or an acidotic pH, right? So we know that because it's the PaCO2 that's out of normal range, we know it's respiratory, and then the pH is low, so we know it's acidic, so it's respiratory acidosis. So the ways to correct this: patients retaining a lot of CO2, right? So we need them to blow off more CO2 or have them take increased or larger breaths. So you can increase your respiratory rate, or you can increase your tidal volume. That will have them either breathe more frequently or breathe larger breaths. It's going to have them expel more of that CO2, correct the pH, and correct the PaCO2 as well. Okay. Moving on to number 2 here. Let's say you have a pH of elevated this time, 7.52. You have a PaCO2 of 24. You have a PaO2 81, bicarb of 22, and oxygen saturation of 95. All right, once again, just go, you see this is elevated. You see the PaCO2 is low. It's normally 35 to 45, 80 to 100, so that's good. Bicarb 22 to 26, that's good. Oxygen saturation 95 to 100, perfect. So once again, we know that it's respiratory because the PaCO2 is the value that's not within normal limits, and it's alkalotic because the pH elevated. So you have a respiratory alkalosis. And how do we correct that? So you need the patient to retain more CO2, right? So how do you do that? You can either decrease the respiratory rate, or you can have them take smaller breaths by decreasing the tidal volume. And then third, last example, we'll see if we can squeeze in here. Let's say we have a pH of 7.41. We have a PaCO2 of 36. We have a PaO2 of 62. A bicarb of 24. And an oxygen saturation of 91. Okay, so we go down here, 7.35 to 7.45, perfect. 35 to 45, yes. 80 to 100, no. Bicarb 22 to 26, yes. SaO2 95 to 100, no. So this patient needs some oxygen, right? Oxygen's too low. So this patient is hypoxemic. And then how do we correct this? Like we said, you can either increase the FiO2 or increase the PEEP. That's how you correct that. I will say that these three examples are very basic examples. A lot of times your patient will have this actually kind of mixed acidosis or mixed alkalosis, whatever it may be. So for example, like in example 1, so here, our only values on these examples that I'm given that are out of line are just basically the pH and one other value, right? But you could have something where like this value is also, the bicarb's trying to help correct the pH, so maybe it's elevated to, so it's 33, so that's also out of the normal limits of 22 to 26. So it can definitely be, a lot more complicated, but that is definitely a video for a different time. This is just the basics of the video, and the main thing, like the main takeaway from this video is this here. If you can understand how to correct the pH based on the PaCO2, so respiratory rate or tidal volume, and then oxygenation can either be fixed via FiO2 or PEEP. That is the big takeaway here. And if you can understand that recap and walk through some of these examples, then I think that's a good place to start. So hopefully you learned something. If you liked the video, please like and subscribe. Help me get the channel to grow a little bit. And thank y'all for watching. I'll see you on the next video.